Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back. Hope you had a good break. Students, you all caught up with reading. There's a brilliant piece in the current Atlantic, hard copy Atlantic. It's also online by Rose Horwich, who's a former Yale student, my student, senior thesis student, 2 years ago. She now has her own byline at the Atlantic after only 2 years, so, no big deal. But it's all about, she interviewed all kinds of people across academia. It's all about how the evidence shows that students in America, none at Yale, of course, do not really read whole books. Now, that's not a brand new claim, but boy, did she find the goods. And actually, the whole argument of the piece is that students at elite schools don't either, but none of you. First, oh, songs for a prelude, lightly strike on the stretched tympanum pride and joy of my city. How she led the rest to arms, how she gave the cue. How at once with the little limbs unwaiting, a moment she sprang. Oh, superb, oh, Manhattan, my own, my peerless. Oh, strongest, you in the hour of danger, in crisis. Oh, truer than steel, how you sprang, how you threw off the costumes of peace with indifferent hand, how your soft opera music changed, and the drum and the fife were heard in their stead. How you led to war that shall serve for our prelude, songs of soldiers. That's one of many of Walt Whitman's poems that he wrote in 1861. This is Whitman, the young Whitman. Love the tilt of the hat on old Walt. Among the other poems he wrote in 1861, and I use this for obvious reasons, a war fever swept this country, north and south, in ways that are actually hard today to fully grasp. Part of what we want to do with this lecture is to try to understand why. What did they say they were fighting for? What was this about, especially after Fort Sumter? He wrote a poem called 1861. It's a little long, but I'll only use a piece of it. Armed year, it reads, year of struggle. No dainty rhymes or sentimental love verses for you, terrible year. This was Whitman. He would speak. Whitman wrote about everything in the human experience. He'd even speak to a year. Hello, 1861. Not you as some pale poetling seated at a desk, lisping cadenza's piano, but as a strong man erect, clothed in blue clothes, advancing, carrying a rifle on your shoulder. With well-gristled body and sunburnt face and hands with a knife in the belt at your side, as I heard you shouting loud, your sonorous voice ringing across the continent, heard your determined voice launch forth again and again, year that suddenly sang the mouths of the round-lipped cannon, I repeat you, hurrying, crashing, sad, distracted year. 1861 was exciting, thrilling for some, an experience like nothing else in their lives. The humdrum of normal life was transformed. Young men who were clerks in shops, doing drudgery on farms, walking behind a stinking donkey with a plow, could go to town and enlist and have the greatest adventure of their lives. distracted year, exciting year. He also wrote a poem called Beat, Beat Drums. I'll spare you that one for now. It's so warlike. Whitman caught it. So did Theodore Winthrop. Think back to your reading now of the Yale and Slavery book. Theodore Winthrop was the first Yale graduate killed in the war, so far as we know. He was an 1848 graduate. He was killed in one of the very first battles of the war at Big Bethel, which is now it's on June 10th. That's how early. June 10th, 1860. It was now in West Virginia, way up there in what was then Northern Virginia. A total defeat by the Union. So it wasn't a very big battle by comparison to everything to come, but it was a humiliating Union defeat, and he was killed on the field. A campus publication waited 9 months to eulogize him. I don't know. We didn't figure out exactly why. Maybe it had something to do with the defeat. Not sure. Winthrop was born here in New Haven. He was the nephew of Theodore Dwight Woolsey, the president of Yale. Woolsey's nephew, first Yale killed. He was a poet, a novelist, a travel writer. He'd gone all over the American West. This was a big deal in the middle of the 19th century, travel writing. He was very good at it. He was quite an adventurer. He even trekked the Isthmus of Panama. I wrote about that for the Atlantic. It's a great tradition. Yale is writing for the Atlantic. Some of them live. He said he was enlisting. He wrote a note or letter to his uncle, Woolsey, president. Said he was enlisting, quote, for the purpose of lending my aid to the great work of attempting to get rid of slavery in this country. At least at that moment, that's what he said he was fighting for. I didn't put his picture up. It's in the book. He enlisted in the 7th New York Regiment, and there they are. This is a famous painting. I think it's still held at the Boston Fine Arts Museum. This is an incredibly romantic painting of the March of the 7th Regiment, 7th New York Regiment. Probably down Broadway, I should know this, or Fifth Avenue, not sure, going off to war in in late May. It was one of the very first regiments if you know your Central Park at all, there's a huge monument to the 7th New York, right near the, what's it called, the Tavern on the Green. Now, he had left behind drawers full of unpublished articles. This guy was a writer. He had left, well, a lot of you, we all have written a few poems we put in a drawer and no one ever gets to see them, right? I wrote some terrible poetry in my life and virtually no one has ever seen them. Don't even try. But in those drawers, oh good Lord, was a unfinished, well, almost finished novel manuscript with what by any standard would be gay, queer themes. He had an apartment in Greenwich Village. His roommate was none other than Frederick Church, the famous painter, Hudson River School painter. They were not only buddies, they were roommates, probably lovers. He was in this march, commemorated in this painting. And he left a description of that day. That's something no one could ever forget. He said, "Only one who passed as we did through that tempest of cheers 2 miles long can know the terrible enthusiasm of that occasion. I could hardly hear the rattle of our own gun carriages and only once or twice the music of our band came to me muffled and quelled by the uproar. Handkerchiefs, of course, came floating down upon us from the windows like snow. Pretty little gloves pelted us with love taps. Who wouldn't go? Who wouldn't join to have that kind of fun? Now, he also wrote, our presence here, he said, was the inevitable sequel of past events. Now, this is when he got to Washington, and this gets even better. I don't want to go on too long about Winthrop, but when they got to Washington, there was nowhere for regiments to be housed just yet. They were coming by the dozens. They were housed on the floor of the House of Representatives. They put down their knapsacks, and 800 or 900 guys slept overnight on the floor of the House. I mean, how cool was that? That might be worth dying for. Maybe. He said, we appeared with bayonets and bullets because of the bosh uttered on this floor, because of the bills with treasonable stump speeches in their bellies passed here, because of the cowardice of the poltroons, the arrogance of the bullies who had here cooperated to blind and corrupt the minds of the people. He knows who he's blaming for this war. His body was finally returned to New Haven in a very special ceremony. Yale students met his coffin at the train station. Streets were closed off, flags draped all along the route, and he's buried right over in Grove Street Cemetery. With time, there would be less attention to the dead coming home at this train station and 1,000 others like it, all across the country. Okay. War is that horrible thing that most people don't want to have to think about. Good reason. I've always loved the passage in Isaiah 2:4. Maybe I've said this before. And he shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Rather shall they learn war no more. Learn war, sometimes that's translated study war. And as I've always said, I've always believed in the first half of that, but not the last part. It's a terrible mistake to not study war. It will come for you. It will come for us. It always does. The greatest modernist satirical writer who was a veteran of the war, Ambrose Bierce. I'll quote him a little later on in next week probably. Ambrose Bierce wrote one satirical short story after another. Every short story ends the same way, in the horrific death of somebody. He was only wounded 3 times in the war, once with a solid shot that hit him in the head and should have killed him, but it didn't. A lot of people thought the rest of his life he was crazy, and he may have been. A very dark man. And among the many, 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 many unforgettable lines he wrote was, "Only fools forget the causes of war." He shot 3 times. The first time was at the First Battle of Bull Run. But you just go a couple pages ahead in Isaiah 6:8, and this was the text so many preachers in 1861 were preaching from their pulpits, not Isaiah 2:4, and we know this in collected sermons. It says, Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I, Lord. Send me." They loved that text as the nation was going to war. 100,000 enlist, another 100,000 enlist, another 100,000 at first. Now, let's get to Fort Sumter here in a minute. But look, we'll get to the leadership in this war for sure, you betcha. Grant, Lee, Sheridan, Longstreet, so on. They are very important. It's a mistake to not study leadership in war. But wars are fought by these guys. We don't even know his name. He was an enlistee in 1861, a volunteer in Illinois. He barely looks 16. He could be even younger. He needs a meal already. And these guys, as soon as they would get to camp, photographers followed the armies everywhere. They'd have their pictures. This guy didn't carry a sword. He's a private. But by God, when he had his photo taken to send home to Mom and his sisters and everybody, he had a sword. Some of them would load up their belt buckles with guns and all kinds of stuff. Look at me. We know this guy's name. His name is Private John Worth, the Richmond Howitzer Battalion, Confederacy, 1861. He's pretty loaded up. He's got his rifle with a fixed bayonet. He's got his, his cartridge box on his side. He's got his knapsack. That's a studio photograph, or some kind of studio they set up. He's ready. So was this guy. We don't know his name either. He's among the first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of former slaves. The common parlance of the Civil War, we'll call them contrabands. Contraband of war, seized property of war. In a Union camp in late 1861 into 62, it was a huge issue. We'll come back to this when we deal with emancipation. It was a huge issue. What were Union officers to do with all of these former slaves, especially in places like Virginia, coming in by the few, and then by the dozens, and then by the hundreds? What to do? I want to jump ahead. Well, unfortunately, I got my pictures a little out of... Unfortunately, so many of these people are going to end up here, tended to by the guys with the pine boxes and the burial crews. And of course, the bands were always playing. At the beginning of the war anyway, almost every Union regiment had a band. A band. And we have ample evidence at major battles as late as Gettysburg of regiments where their colonels were interrupted by a cell phone. No. Regiments literally marching out of a woods toward battle with their band playing. I mean, it's a different century. I'll come back to that, and to Charleston, and to that. But I want to tell you about this guy real briefly. He's going to come back in the subsequent 2 weeks. His name is Charles Harvey Brewster. That picture I showed you of the former enslaved guy at a Union camp working for the soldiers. Charlie Brewster was a 27-year-old store clerk in Northampton, Massachusetts in the spring of 1861. He didn't have any college education. He had 2 sisters and a mother. His father had died. He considered himself a failure. He hadn't married yet, he hadn't met anybody who would marry him. But my God, when the war broke out, he enlisted as fast as he could in the 10th Massachusetts, a regiment formed all over the western part of Massachusetts, but headquartered in Northampton. He wrote almost 250 letters, almost all of them from the front. They're housed, I believe still, at the Northampton Historical Society. I was contacted, oh God, it's a long time ago now, by an editor at UMass Press who said, there's a guy over in Northampton who's collecting these Civil War letters. He wants somebody to read them and edit them and publish them, and would you consider this? And I said, no, I don't want to do another book of Civil War letters. There's only 10,000 of them. And then they sent them to me. I said, all right, I'll look at them. I started reading his letters, and they were flat out amazing. He was very literate and reasonably well read. And his letters just reveal his values, his fears, his terrors, his chutzpah, his pride. See that photo? That's right after he was made an officer. By God, he became a lieutenant. And he got a sash and a sword. And he writes home to his mom and his sisters, and he gets his own tent. He writes as though it's his wedding night, but he's marrying the army. Amazing. This is a kid who he needed recognition. He needed something to do. He was racist. He used the N-word as a verb, but he was a Lincoln voter. He had come to kind of loathe the imagery of the South that the Republican Party had sold to Northern voters. There was a slave power conspiracy. He believed that. And when he got into Northern Virginia, he writes endlessly about what terrible farmers these Virginians are. They couldn't build a fence if their life depended on it. He's a good New Englander. They don't know how to enclose land. Look at this. There are disasters down here. They need to be conquered. He will survive all the way through the war. He had 2 horses shot out from, he got to ride a horse eventually as an officer. That was cool too, he had to write home about that. He will survive all the way to the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in the summer of 1864, when his regiment had to be mustered out because there weren't enough left of them. And by then he had become the adjutant of the regiment, which meant the recorder. It was his job to prepare all the list of the dead and how they died and where they died, to send back home to Northampton, to the newspaper and the parents, or wives, or families. That was his job, recording the dead. And after Spotsylvania, they didn't have enough to be mustered. They were mustered out, what was left of them. He came back home to Northampton. He hated civilian life by this time, 3 years at war. He had contempt for civilians. If he met a guy who hadn't enlisted, that guy was in some trouble. And a very typical thing, soldiers having contempt for people who don't join, especially in wars like this, all-out wars. What does he do? He re-enlisted. He went back to Virginia, not in a combat role, but he became a recruiter of black soldiers. He worked out in Norfolk. He sat in an office most of the time, and then he worked the streets, recruiting black men into the Union Army. He helped produce an entire regiment of black soldiers for Grant's army before Petersburg. And he writes moving letters, again, to his mother. Women were always his audience for his letters, which is interesting. And there's so much in his letters about gender, his gender. He writes to his sisters and mother, and he says, by the way, he's writing for black women who aren't literate, letters to the front to their husbands, or their brothers, or their lovers. And he sits there, And he writes back home and he says, you know, I'm getting to understand this idea of love letters. This is really interesting. It's my new training. It prepares me now. Maybe I can do this, find some lady. But he's doing this for black women. And by then, Charles Harvey Brewster has become a complete supporter of emancipation. At first, he saw emancipation really as just a measure to win the war. You gotta free the slaves to defeat this decrepit South. But now he's arguing they're human beings. They love each other, and I'm writing their love letters. He gets converted, sort of, by the black women whose letters he's recording. He came back to Massachusetts after the war, to Northampton, Massachusetts, and he opened a florist. The first ready-made flower outfit. He had a greenhouse. He made a very good living on it, and he participated in Union veterans organizations until he died in the 1890s, and his daughter collected his letters. It's an amazing story. I'll bring him back here and there for his descriptions of what he goes through later. Now, secession and Fort Sumter. You know, the thing about war is that we hate it. We should hate it. But there's a human obligation to discern its meaning. There's a human obligation to discern why somebody wins or loses and how they do that. All right. I'm preaching too much here. But let's, oh, where's my map of, oh, come on, man. Oh, there we are. Charleston Harbor. Now, you all know that when the South seceded, the first 7 states in the Deep South go out fairly quickly. But the other 4 Upper South states do not join the Confederacy until after the firing on Fort Sumter. It was the firing on Fort Sumter that got the some of the upper border states to join the Confederacy. Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, read it. It's on canvas. It's a classic. That speech is remarkable because Lincoln is tortured. It's got olive branch all over it. He's trying to convince Southerners, come on back. We are brothers. We are friends, not enemies, he says. We have shared this story, this union, this America for so long. We are not enemies. But then, the speech has a sword in it. He tells them, it's on you. I should be quoting it, but you go read it. He says, this is on you, my fellow Americans in the South. You have seceded from this union. You must come back. And I invite you to come back. Because otherwise, we will go to war. And he ends, of course, with the famous peroration about the better angels of our nature that draw us to every mutual battlefield of their history. The better angels of our nature. That's a quote from Shakespeare, very typical of Lincoln. Draw a little Shakespeare in here and there all the time. And what he also said in that speech, and I am quoting him here, he said he promised to, quote, hold, occupy, and possess all federal property not yet under the control of, he wouldn't call it the Confederacy yet, but the southern states. Hold, occupy, and possess. The only federal fort along the southern coast, not under Confederate control, by the time he took office, was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is right in the middle of the mouth of Charleston Harbor. As many of you, it's probably some of you have been to Charleston. You can go down to Battery Park. You can see out, it's more than a mile out to Fort Sumter. You can see the fort out there. It's on the horizon. All around the harbor, Confederates by April had stationed almost 100 guns, cannon. All federal cannon, federal property, stolen from federal arsenals or garrisons. So already there's a problem here. What does secession mean? It means a whole lot of illegal activity, but Lincoln's hoping for better angels. Now, he has a so-called April policy. In retrospect, historians have come to call this Lincoln's April policy. Fort Sumter was garrisoned by about 80 troops under the command of one Major Robert Anderson. He'll go on to be a general. Anderson was from Kentucky, a former slaveholder, but stayed with his commission in the Union Army. It was a brand new fort. It wasn't even fully completed yet. Huge, huge stone walls and underground barracks or dungeons. Now, the hawks in his administration, and Lincoln was surrounded by some hawks, who said, basically, go get them. Just go get them. They can't have that fort. And suddenly, Fort Sumter is in the news by about April 1st everywhere. What's going to happen at Fort Sumter? What's going to happen at Fort Sumter? In fact, the northern newspaper headlines are fascinating on this. There were headlines April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. So I read, I'll just give you three of them. One read, "Do we have a government?" Assuming the answer to this headline writer was no. Or, "Wanted, a policy." Or even better, "Come to the point. What are you going to do, Lincoln? Do it." Whatever you're going to do. There was great tension, restlessness. What's this secession going to mean? If there's going to be a war, go do it. I mean, shoot a few of them. Sort of like January 6th. Maybe, never mind. Maybe a few of them should have. But the hawks wanted, just go attack it. In fact, one of them writes personally, a very influential Republican writes personally to Lincoln and says, "Give up Sumter, sir, and you are as dead politically as John Brown is physically." Now, Lincoln couldn't have missed the point of that. In his own cabinet, his Secretary of State, the most powerful person in the cabinet, was William H. Seward. I'm sure you all know by now that Seward became his principal rival for the candidacy. He kept his rivals nearby, team of rivals and all of that. Seward led the doves, so to speak. Seward wanted to just back off, keep backing off. Just let cooler heads prevail in the South. He kept arguing with Lincoln for what Seward called voluntary reconstruction. It's a great phrase. I mean, it's a good idea. They'll come to their senses. They will realize they can't do this. They don't have the resources. Yeah, they stole some cannon, but what else do they have? Yeah, they got a few iron furnaces in Virginia. They can't stand up to us if we really create armies. Commissioners were sent from the Confederate government in March and early April to Washington, D.C. They didn't meet with Lincoln, they met with Seward. Seward gave them a promise that Fort Sumter would be given up, which he did not have authority to do, and he shouldn't have. In fact, Seward should have kept his mouth shut. He did not. Lincoln told Seward, in effect, shut up. Seward didn't, though. He launched a kind of a crazy plan. It didn't go anywhere, but he said, let's declare war on Spain and France to unify the country. Remember the old movie, Wag the Dog and all that stuff? We're going to declare war on our former enemies. France? Not really been a former. Anyway, and that'll bring national unity. A foreign war. Lincoln said, no. No. Now, Seward is not a dummy, and he's trying to find anything that would be short of war. He'd also made, well, as I said, promises to some of these Southern commissioners that all had to be put aside. Lincoln's plan was this. It's propaganda. And Lincoln is learning this as he goes, day by day, night by night. He separated the question of reinforcement, which was a military act, from provisions, food, for those 80 men on Fort Sumter, which was a humanitarian act. He was going to do the humanitarian thing, not the military thing. He would notify, and he did, Southern officials. You know, they have telegraph now. They can get messages through almost like that. And if they attacked around Fort Sumter, around Charleston Harbor, they would be firing the first shot. It's always been debated. I mean, historians don't do this anymore, but there was quite a debate for years. Whole books were written about this. Lincoln on the first shot and all of that. You know, how he maneuvered the Confederacy into the first shot. Well, he kind of did. He got a little lucky, too. He called, he's going to send an expedition, like 3 ships, down to Charleston Harbor full of provisions for those 80 men. Fort Sumter is still federal property, he said. We have to feed our troops. It's a classic kind of support the troops. Huh? He said, quote, he was doing a mission of humanity, bringing food to hungry men. Oppose that. But it was a direct challenge to the Confederacy. Put up or shut up. By the way, in the hold of one of those ships, it was jammed with gunpowder and muskets. The Confederacy accepted Lincoln's challenge. There was a prolonged suspense, but it was nearly over. On April 9, the Confederate cabinet off in Montgomery, Alabama, made a fateful decision. They voted unanimously in a cabinet meeting with Jefferson Davis to strike the first blow at Fort Sumter, to shoot, to fire on that fort and take it. And they did. 2 days later, or 36 hours later, a bombardment went on for 36 hours, almost 100 cannon. Amazingly, nobody was killed on the fort because they were all in these underground dungeons. But the fort had to be surrendered. Anderson surrendered on April 11th. Anderson surrendered on April 14, The firing occurs on April 12th, forgive me. Dates matter, because it will be 4 years to the day that the U.S. flag taken down on April 14 will be raised again 4 years later. Flag was taken down. Anderson's troops went out in the interior of the fort. They held a 21-gun salute, and 2 men were killed when a barrel of gunpowder blew up next to them as they were doing the salute. The first 2 men killed themselves. Now, the relief expedition that Lincoln had sent had just arrived outside the harbor, out here. It never got to the fort. The troops were eventually evacuated, and 1 day later, on the 15th of April, Abraham Lincoln called under his powers as commander-in-chief and the power to put down a domestic insurrection. He called for 75,000 troops, volunteers. And he said in the Declaration to put down insurrection. He will get many, many more than that. The war fever that swept the South, the North and the South, but one might say especially the North, after Fort Sumter is hard to entirely grasp. But it swept the South too. They didn't have a Whitman, but they had a poet who became for a while their kind of poet laureate. His name was Henry Timrod. Now, this is, with apologies to to Whitman. This was Timrod's poem. It came out right after Fort Sumter. It's called A Cry to Arms. Ho, woodsmen of the mountainside. I told you, he's not a Whitman. Ho, dwellers in the vales. Ho, ye who by chafing tide have roughened in the gales. He's going to rhyme everything. Leave barn and byre, leave kin and cot, lay by the bloodless spade. Let desk and case and counter rot, and burn your books of trade. The despot roves your fairest lands until he flies or fears. Your fields must grow but arm-led bands. Your sheaves be sheaves of spears. Give up to mildew and to rust the useless tools of gain, and feed your country's sacred dust with floods of crimson rain. I won't even read. I mean, it's got a lot more verses. That was reprinted in newspaper after newspaper after newspaper. Timrod was the Confederate poet. Very quickly, 4 states will secede, and this was crucial. If the Confederacy had never had Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, or Tennessee, it isn't clear how they could have ever conducted a war. Let's back up to the map I had. There we are. You can see Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas were the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th states to join the Confederacy. Delaware, West Virginia isn't made a state until 1863 in a, by and large, unconstitutional act by the Lincoln administration. In wartime, things happen. And Kentucky and Missouri never technically left the Union. More on that in a second. But the secession, especially of Virginia, on the 17th of April, 3 days after the surrender at Fort Sumter. Now, keep in mind, Virginia had already held an earlier secession convention back in March and voted no. Now, divided vote, but no on secession. The whole western part of Virginia was frankly always against secession, and so were other pockets of Virginia. But after Sumter, and the argument now was coercion had been committed, Virginia voted in a secession ordinance, 88 to 55. 55 members of that Virginia secession convention voted no. It doesn't mean they didn't ultimately support the Confederacy, but they voted no on secession. Divided. Arkansas went out on May 6th in a vote of 69 to 1. Now, I know one of you looked up those 2 Whigs who voted, okay. If you can find that one Arkansas delegate, man, you get a B+. No, I'm just kidding. North Carolina, in convention, May 20, 1861, unanimously. A lot of politicking went on, but they voted unanimously to leave the Union. And then Tennessee, the last to join on June 8th, 2 days before the Battle of Big Bethel, where our guy Winthrop at Yale was killed, voted in a referendum. They did this by different means. Some had conventions with delegates elected to them. Some had Tennessee, they had a referendum. The vote was 2 to 1. Eastern Tennessee, as many of you know, is not like Central Tennessee or Western Tennessee. It's hill country. There weren't many slaves there. By July 1, 41,885 Virginians alone had enlisted in the Confederate Army. Biggest army ever assembled in North America at that point. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri never technically left the Union. Kentucky passed a resolution of neutrality. Very difficult thing to do in this war. And Kentucky, rest assured, was a horrible place to be in the Civil War. Here's what we know about Kentucky. Approximately 50,000 Kentuckians fought for the Union. 24,000 of those 50 were black men. By far, per capita, more black soldiers came from Kentucky than anywhere else in the Union. About 35,000 Kentuckians fought for the Confederacy. You think we've got problems with neighbors talking to each other today about this election? They had problems in Kentucky. The next farm down the road or your neighbor in Louisville, don't ask. Delaware only had a small slave population. They're going to stay in the Union, although they're going to be the first state Lincoln will go to by 1862 to try to convince them to come back into the Union with a special deal, and Delaware will say no because the deal was they had to end slavery. Maryland, extremely important in the war. The bloodiest day of the war will be fought in Maryland at Antietam. What will Maryland do? Union troops can't get to Washington or to Northern Virginia. Well, they're going through Maryland. And there were riots in Baltimore because of it. Maryland was horribly divided. Western Shore, Eastern Shore. We know that approximately 50,000 white people, men, fought in the war from Maryland. It's not that big a state. About 30,000 on the Union side, 9,000 of whom were black, and about 20,000 on the Confederate side. The Confederate flag, the battle flag, has 13 stars, but it never really had 13 states. Missouri, my goodness. Missouri was the worst place to be in a non-seceded southern state. Vigilante war was practiced in Missouri over and over and over. A guerrilla war, actually. In Missouri, the estimate is that about 80,000 Missourians fought for the Union, and about 30,000 fought for the Confederacy. It was a brothers' war now. There are 1,000 examples of this. Henry Clay, the great Kentuckian, now dead, Mr. Compromiser, runs for president 3 times. The Henry Clay. He had 7 grandsons. 3 fought for the Union and 4 for the Confederacy. I've never looked into it, but I always wonder what Clay reunions were like after the war. John J. Crittenden, also of Kentucky, for whom the Crittenden Compromise measures is named, the last-ditch attempts in March of '61 to come up with compromise measures that didn't work. Crittenden had 1 son who became a general in the Union Army and 1 son who became a general in the Confederate Army. They were polarized. Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, had 4 brothers and 3 brothers-in-law. They all fought for the Confederacy. Lincoln laid his head on the pillow every night knowing that Mary's got 7 brothers and brother-in-laws on the other side. And it led to all kinds of scandalous, terrible stuff that was said about her being a traitor and on and on and on. She had plenty of problems, but one of them was not being a traitor. John Pemberton from Pennsylvania became a Confederate general, and he will end up surrendering at Vicksburg. George H. Thomas, Virginia-born, remained in the Union and would become a major figure, a major general. He was the Union commander at Chickamauga. And there's so many other stories. There's the story of Clifton and William Prentice of the 6th Maryland Infantry Union and the 2nd Maryland Infantry Confederate. Brothers. One on one side, one on the other. They were both wounded at Petersburg, Virginia, April 2, 1865. and died in the same field hospital right next to one another. It's a brothers' war, it's a family war, it's a horrible war. Now, yeah, I didn't get through everything today, but it's because I'm telling too damn many stories, but let me leave you with this one. One of the most confusing and puzzling and difficult places to be in 1861 was West Point. What the hell are they going to do at West Point now? This is the American Military Academy where they train all the officers. And by 1860, it had a great tradition. And it's full of men now who were, the faculty, the leaders were all Mexican War veterans. Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, Winfield Scott Hancock, George Thomas, George S. Meade, Joseph Hooker, John Sedgwick, the list goes on. And then the Confederates, the list goes on and on and on. Who was the superintendent of West Point when the war broke out? No, Lee wasn't anymore. He had been back in the 50s. It was Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard of Louisiana. Only served 5 days from January 23 to 28, 1861, and then he resigned his commission to go home to Louisiana. And he wrote a message to his fellow Southerners at West Point. He said, quote, "Watch me. When I jump, you jump. What's the use of jumping too soon?" West Point had a 5-year course. If you got in as a cadet, you took a 5-year course. It had been written by the then Secretary of War in the 1850s, Jefferson Davis, and the superintendent of West Point in the mid-50s, Robert E. Lee. And what's the motto of West Point, of course? Honor, duty, country. Honor, duty, country. So what are you going to do? They had a hell of a choice. Duty meant above all obedience to orders, right? That's what you do. You're in the Army now, dude. Okay. The librarian at West Point was a man named Oliver Otis Howard. Eventually, Howard University will be named for him. He'll lose his arm at Gettysburg. The so-called one-armed general, O. Howard, an actual abolitionist general who got into all kinds of heat and terrible stuff with his fellow generals. He left this little remark. He said, "Probably no other place existed where men grappled more sensitively with the troublesome problem of secession than West Point." There was an Ohio cadet named Tully McCrae who wrote to his sweetheart back home, quote, "This has been an eventful week in the history of West Point. There has been such a stampede of cadets that was never known before. 32 resigned and were relieved from duty on Monday." This is April 22nd, after Sumter. "And since then, enough to increase the number to more than 40. There are now few cadets from any Southern state here. In fact, 74 Southern cadets resigned, officially resigned, and were dismissed and went home to their Southern states and joined the Confederacy." That was a rate even higher than the number per capita of Southerners who left Yale. Last little point. You've heard of George Armstrong Custer. Custer's last stand and all that nonsense. Custer became a major figure in the Civil War as a cavalry commander. There's Charlie again. Custer left this reminiscence. Custer got in trouble in 1861 for bad behavior, probably drunkenness, who knows what, insubordination. He was a ne'er-do-well. He was always getting in trouble. And on a day in early June, He was walking guard duty. You ever been to West Point? It's way up on the cliff on the Hudson River. Beautiful sight. Well, Custer had been given duty to march sentinel like all day long up on the cliff. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And he noticed down at the steamboat landing on the river a last group of Southerners, Southern cadets, about to leave. Quote, "Too far off to exchange verbal adieu," says Custer. "Even if military discipline had permitted it, they caught sight of me as step by step I reluctantly paid the penalty of offended regulations and raised their hats in token farewell, to which, first casting my eyes about to see that no watchful superior was in view, I responded by bringing my musket to present." They'll all be killing each other within a year, all over the country. Now, next time I'll begin with the various kinds of military and strategic advantages one side had over the other, and we'll take this war through 1861 and 1862. Thanks.